Hey, it's Benji Cole, son of Al Cole from CBS Radio and host of People of Distinction, the talk that gives an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and successful people on the planet. Run to our website, peopleofdistinction.org for more info, or you can always email me directly at benji@alcoleenterprises.com. And on the line with us today, we have James O. Chipman. We'll be discussing his fantastic book, The Murder Trials of JFK, available for purchase through Amazon as well as barnesandnoble.com. And guys, I will say that James was brought to our network, People of Distinction, today by some of the best movers in the business, Far Eastern Marketing Publishing. So if you have a book that you'd like moved, well, make sure you're doing yourself a favor and you're contacting Far Eastern. And you can find out more information on them at fareasternmarketing.com. Sit back, strap in, and get ready for a wild ride, because I promise you, you are going to learn so much, but you're also going to be very entertained. So without further ado, let's jump right in. James, first and foremost, welcome to People of Distinction, and thank you so much for being a guest. How are you?
Just fine. Glad I could be on your show.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we're very much looking forward to this, James, and I know we have so much to cover. So without further ado, let's jump right in, man. The Murder Trials of JFK. Tell us a little bit more about your book.
I wrote it as a murder trial. Each reader is a member of the jury. Listen to the testimonies of the witnesses and then make your verdict. Today is going to be the biggest expose of the Kennedy assassination since Geraldo Rivera showed an outraged audience on Goodnight America, the Zapruder film, on March 6, 1975. Allow me to tell you a little bit about the book. I wrote it as a murder trial. Each reader is a member of the jury. Listen to the testimonies of the witnesses and then make your verdict. It was not difficult for me to write the book because I had been researching the assassination of President Kennedy for over 50 years. I have a private library, and I've been collecting information on the internet. So my book was already written in my mind. What I would like the audience to know after reading it is that after almost 60 years, the world will finally know the truth behind the death of JFK. They will also know why he died and why it matters. If Kennedy had won re-election in 1964, there would not have been an American Vietnam War. You will learn things about Lyndon B. Johnson that you would not believe were possible. The message I want them to receive is why his assassination started a deep distrust that Americans have with their government that continues to this day. A major part of this distrust happened because the government lied to us about the assassination and lied to us about the Vietnam War. The conspiracy theory is what Hoover, the FBI, came up with and then passed it along to the news media, the public, and the Warren Commission. The two people who were majorly responsible for all the controversy in the Kennedy assassination are Hoover, the FBI, and LBJ. They lived on the same street in Washington for 19 years. They both hated the Kennedys, and they both would have lost their jobs if Kennedy was reelected in 1964. Hoover had to have an open and shut case because if there is an extended investigation, it will show that Oswald was under surveillance by the FBI before Kennedy was killed, and that Oswald and Ruby were paid informers for the FBI. It would have also shown that the FBI used illegal wiretaps on phones and illegal break-ins to solve many of their cases. Hoover had spent over 30 years building up the reputation of the FBI and ran it with the directive of, quote, do not embarrass the FBI, unquote. An extended investigation would have been a disaster for Hoover and the FBI. Only witnesses were called who could support this official narrative of what happened, and all the other witnesses were not allowed to testify or had their testimonies changed. The FBI, the Secret Service, and the CIA were not interested in solving the case. They only wanted to protect their vested interests and were busy covering up any evidence and destroying any records that could tie them to the assassination. In America today, there's probably not more than 1 in 100,000 who has ever heard of the two assassination plots that occurred against Kennedy before he was shot in Dallas. One was in Chicago on November 2nd, 1963, and the other was in Tampa, Florida on November 18th, 1963. With two valid attempts on his life in less than 3 weeks, The prudent course of action for Kennedy should have been to call off all parade routes, period. It was almost like he had a death wish. He told Jackie when they got to Dallas, quote, "If somebody wants to shoot me from a window with a rifle, nobody can stop it, so why worry about it," unquote. Kennedy was warned repeatedly before going to Dallas, and they tried to talk him out of it. And he said, quote, "If this is the way life is, if this is the way it's going to end, this is the way it's going to end," unquote. Abraham W. Bolden was the first black Secret Service agent in the White House. He saw the similarities between Chicago and Dallas and noticed that the Secret Service had issued new ID booklets after Dallas. He was very vocal about it and had to be silenced. He was put on trial for accepting a bribe in a counterfeiting case, which was totally false, and sentenced to 6 years in prison. What's My Line was a very popular TV show in the early 1960s on CBS. A panel of experts would try to discover what the occupation was of a mystery guest, and Dorothy Kilgallen was one of the panelists. In real life, she was an investigative reporter, and she was very good at her job. On August 3, 1962, she became the first reporter to refer publicly to Marilyn Monroe's relationship with the Kennedy. Within 48 hours, Marilyn was found dead of a drug overdose at a Los Angeles residence. The inquiry into her death was marred by numerous unanswered questions and contradictions in the medical findings. Kilgallen wrote, quote, "The real story hasn't been told, not by a long shot," unquote. Her biggest scoop, an exclusive interview with Oswald's killer, Jack Ruby, got her killed. She told friends after her Ruby interview that, quote, "she was about to blow the JFK case sky high," unquote. On November 8, 1965, she was found in her home dead after her regular appearance on What's My Line. She was found propped up in a bed she never slept in, fully clothed, with a book she had read months before. And of course, her notes were never found, and a close friend and whom she had confided with was also found dead. She had no drug or alcohol problems in her life, so why would she kill herself, especially after having the story of a lifetime to reveal? And what do you do if you can't sleep? You turn out the lights. In the murder scenes of both Dorothy and Marilyn, the lights were still on. The best evidence to suggest that the several drugs found in Dorothy's blood were not self-administered is that only one drug, the one she normally took, was on the glass on the nightstand. Dorothy's inquiry into Jack Ruby's ties to the mob and her relentless exploration of the Warren Commission's gross inadequacies threatened to expose dark secrets that powerful people, both in and out of government, did not want revealed. The prosecution will now call to the stand Jack Ruby. Can you remember what you said to reporters after you were granted a new trial? Quote, "Yes, I said the world will never know the true facts of what occurred and the people who carried it out," unquote. Are these people in very high positions, Jack? Yes. Why has no one seen the Zapruder film? Because certain people with enough power didn't want you to see it. Imagine what would have happened if the American public was shown that film. Quote, "If Adlai Stevenson was the vice president, there never would have been an assassination of our beloved president." When asked to explain, he said, quote, "Well, the answer is the man in office now, Lyndon B. Johnson. A whole new form of government is going to take over the country, and I know I won't live to see you another time." Read A Texan Looks at Lyndon by J. Everett Haley, and it will open your eyes to a lot of things. This man is a Nazi in the worst order, unquote. He goes on to say, "Isn't it strange that Oswald could get a job in the book building 2 weeks before the assassination, and JFK did not know himself when he was going to visit Dallas? Only one person could have had that information, and that man was Johnson, who knew weeks in advance as to what was going to happen, because he was the one who was going to arrange the trip for the president. This had been planned long before the president himself knew about it. The only one who gained by the shooting of the president was Johnson. What would the Russians, Castro, or anyone else gain by eliminating the president?" Rose Jeremy drove from Miami to Louisiana with 2 men. On the night of November 20th, 1963, they stopped at the Silver Slipper Lounge in Eunice, Louisiana. One of the men threw her out the door and onto the street. Previously, they told her their purpose was to pick up some money and to kill Kennedy. She saw an article in the Sunday newspaper about Ruby killing Oswald, and it said Ruby did not know Oswald. She laughed and said, quote, Ruby and Oswald were very good friends, unquote. She then said that she used to work for Ruby as a stripper in his nightclub, and because of her employment, she also knew Oswald. She was a drug courier for Jack Ruby, and that he and Oswald had been shacking up for years. Just 4 days after the assassination, with a provable, credible, live witness with a potentially explosive testimony, she was released from the Musa Memorial Hospital. Both the Dallas and federal investigative authorities declined to question her. Here we have this incredible eyewitness testimony that Ruby knew Oswald, that Ruby was involved in an international drug circle, that two Latins were aware of and perhaps involved in a plot to kill Kennedy, and that Ruby probably knew the men. This fantastic lead, the type investigators would die for, was being shunted aside by Captain Wilkes of the Dallas Police Department. Ed Hoffman was a deaf mute, and since he could not hear, he had learned to be much more observant with his eyes than most. He was at the scene of the assassination 45 minutes before the presidential caravan arrived at Dealey Plaza. He saw two cars drive into the parking lot behind the fence, a white four-door and a light green Rambler station wagon, which was used as a getaway vehicle. He saw two white males standing behind the fence. One of the men was stocky and middle-aged and was dressed in a dark blue business suit with a black hat. The other man was wearing railroad-type coveralls. One of these men aimed a rifle over the fence, and he saw a puff of smoke by the guy in the suit. He then tossed the rifle to the other guy, who disassembled the rifle and placed it in a tool bag. A policeman came running up with a drawn revolver and confronted the man in the suit, who then showed him his empty hands and produced some form of ID. The guy in the suit then got in the Rambler on the passenger side, and the two of them drove off. That night, he saw Oswald on television and told his father that they had the wrong man. Gordon Arnold was on leave from the Army and was still in his uniform. He wanted to find a good spot to take pictures with his 16mm camera. Arnold's first choice was the railroad overpass, but he was stopped by a well-dressed man who presented a Secret Service badge, who told him he was not allowed to be there. His second choice was a few feet in front of the fence on the grassy knoll. Quote, just after the car turned onto Elm Street and started towards me, a shot went off over my left shoulder. I felt the bullet rather than heard it, and it went right past my left ear. I had just gotten out of basic training. In my mind, live ammunition was being fired. It was being fired over my head, and I hit the dirt, unquote. This shot would have been the one that hit Kennedy below his Adam's apple and made a hole in his tie. A police officer then came up and confiscated Arnold's film. It was never seen again. It would have been as good as the Zapruder film. It is interesting to note that most of the photographs taken that day that were not confiscated show the crowd rushing up the grassy knoll and not in the direction of the Texas School Book Depository building. The Secret Service said it did not have any men stationed in the Dealey Plaza area. Yet we have several witnesses who were stopped by men with Secret Service ID. If anything indicates there was a conspiracy, this is it. Dr. Charles Crenshaw said, quote, I looked at Kennedy's wounds before we placed him in the coffin. I wanted to know and remember this for the rest of my life. And the rest of my life, I will always know that he was shot from the front, unquote. When Oswald was being treated in the Parkland Memorial Hospital after being shot by Jack Ruby, Dr. Crenshaw said President Johnson called the hospital. He said, quote, would you take a message to the operating surgeon, unquote. I said, sure. He said, I want a deathbed statement from the assassin. And all of a sudden the line was broken. Dr. Crenshaw in the operating room saw a bullet entry wound in his throat that had made a hole in his tie. Several other doctors, along with Crenshaw, saw a large wound in the back of his head above and beyond his right ear, consistent with an exit wound. Richard Carr was working in the courts building, and John Powell was a prisoner on the 6th floor of the jail. Both men saw men on the 6th floor holding rifles and adjusting their scopes. There wasn't just one assassin on the 6th floor, there were several. Captain Wilkes was in charge of the investigation for the Dallas police. When he examined what was assumed to be the sniper's nest on the 6th floor, which meant without any doubt whatsoever that there was a minimum of 2 shooters, and the evidence pointed to even more during the assassination of JFK. According to the Warren Commission report, Oswald fired 3 rounds on the 6th floor, and when Captain Fritz got to that area, there were 3 shell casings on the floor, but only 2 had been fired. Investigation had only lasted for 2 days when Fritz got a person-to-person call from LBJ, who ordered him to stop his investigation. Quote, "You've got your man," unquote. Remember what John Wilkes Booth said when he shot Lincoln? He was then on the stage of Ford's Theater. Quote, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always 2 tyrants. And what did Oswald say? Quote, "I didn't shoot anyone. I'm just a patsy," unquote. They say a picture or a map is worth 1,000 words. Dealey Plaza is at the end point of the parade route. The crowds were thinning out, and all the driver of the limo had to do at this point was accelerate and drive west on Main Street. The Secret Service should never have authorized a 90-degree turn to the right on Houston Street and then another 120-degree turn to the left on Elm Street. This slowed the limo to under 10 miles per hour. The plaza they turned into had 3 buildings from which to fire from, as well as the fence area behind the grassy knoll area and 3 unsecured storm sewer openings in the curb, just a few feet from where Kennedy got shot in the front of his head. This entire area was not secured, and there was no police presence in the building. The Secret Service did not have any of their agents on the grassy knoll, but there were men posing as Secret Service with authentic-looking ID. Just looking at this layout tells even the casual observer that this was a setup. This was a situation between JFK and LBJ in October of 1963. Johnson had been the Senate Majority Leader. Why would he give up such a powerful position to become the Vice President? Because it had been his lifelong ambition since he was 5 years of age to be the President of the United States. And the only way he could achieve this at this point in his life was through the back door. LBJ is going to be dropped from the ticket in 1964. He's going to go to jail because of the Billy Solestes and Bobby Baker scandals. Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, did go to jail. Bobby Kennedy has called in 5 reporters to write up an expose of Johnson, which will be published in Life magazine on the front cover. This all goes away with November 22nd, 1963. It was said that, quote, "We have lost one president by assassination. We cannot afford to lose another president because of scandal." Johnson attended a party at the Clint Murchison Mansion on November 21st, the night before. It was attended by Murchison, a billionaire, J. Edgar Hoover, Richard Nixon, H.L. Hunt, and others. Madeleine Brown, LBJ's mistress of 20 years, was also there. This is what she said, quote, "When Lyndon arrived, they all went into a conference room, and you could just feel the atmosphere. When Lyndon came out, he was red in the face. He took my hand and squeezed it so hard, I thought he was going to break every bone, and then growled in my ear, quote, 'After tonight, those blankety-blank Kennedys will never embarrass me again. That's not a threat, it's a promise,' unquote." There was a violent argument that JFK and LBJ had the morning of the assassination. It was about the seating arrangements of the Kennedy car and the Johnson car. LBJ wanted Jackie and Governor Connolly and and his wife to ride with him. Connolly was a very good friend, and LBJ knew that once the shooting started, Connolly could be wounded or even killed, which is exactly what happened. He wanted Senator Yarborough to ride with Kennedy, who Johnson hated. This shows that LBJ had foreknowledge of the assassination. Officer B.J. Martin made the remarkable observation when he saw LBJ crouched down in his seat, reacting before any shots were fired. Quote, "He started ducking in the car a good 30 to 40 seconds before the first shots were fired," unquote. This claim was validated by a photograph taken by Ike Altgens. In the picture, Lady Bird and Senator Yarborough can be seen, but not Johnson. After the assassination, LBJ insisted that Jackie witness the swearing-in ceremony on Air Force One. He can be seen turning to his right and exchanging a wink with Congressman Albert Thomas, in as much to say, "We pulled it off." Johnson knew well in advance what to expect, He knew it would happen, where it would happen, and when it would happen. These are some of the things LBJ directed the Secret Service to do at the Parkland Memorial Hospital. The limo and Kennedy's body are taken back to Washington. The medical staff was prepared to do an autopsy required by Texas law. There was an argument between Agent Roy Kellerman of the Secret Service and Dr. Earl Rose, the Dallas medical examiner. Rose knew that moving the body from Parkland Hospital would compromise not only the autopsy, but the entire investigation. Quote, "You can't lose the chain of evidence," unquote. Motorcycle policeman Bobby Hargis was riding behind the limo, and he said it was like a bucket of blood thrown back on him from the president's head. This blood splatter has long been used as a method of solving homicides, and the limousine still has this evidence on the trunk. So where do we find Secret Service agents being anxiously employed at the hospital? They're washing off all this evidence. What was Kennedy's greatest ambition as president? Was to break the militaristic ideology that had dominated our country since World War II. What was the greatest struggle in the last 1,000 days of his presidency? It was a continuous fight with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military, and the CIA to avoid getting us into a war. There were incessant schemes to do this. What should the epitaph of JFK be? He kept the peace. He never managed to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the four winds, but these steps placed him in direct conflict with a very powerful agency that at this time in history was accountable to no one. What did JFK learn from the Bay of Pigs fiasco? It taught him two things. One is not to trust generals or the CIA. And the second is, if the American people do not want to use American troops to remove a communist regime 90 miles away from our coast, how could he ask them to use troops to remove a communist regime 9,000 miles away? What was the advice that General Douglas MacArthur gave Kennedy? He gave him a warning, quote, "Anyone wanting to commit American ground forces to the mainland of Asia should have his head examined," unquote. What did Walter Cronkite discuss with Kennedy about Vietnam? President Kennedy said, quote, "Unless a greater effort is made by the South Vietnamese government to win popular support, I don't think the war can be won out there. In the final analysis, it is their war. They are the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them, we can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but it is their people and their government who has to win or lose this struggle. All we can do is help," unquote. What else did the president say about Vietnam? He said, quote, "If I tried to pull out completely from Vietnam, we would have another Joe McCarthy Red Scare on our hands. But I can do it after I am reelected, so we'd better make sure I am reelected," unquote. What action did Kennedy take to do this? On October 11, 1963, he issued National Security Action Memorandum 263, making official policy to withdraw from Vietnam of the bulk of military personnel by the end of 1965. On the morning of November 21st, 1963, as he prepared to leave for Texas, he reviewed a casualty list for Vietnam indicating that more than 100 Americans had been killed there. Shaken and angry, he told his assistant press secretary, Malcolm Kilduff, quote, "It's time to get out. The Vietnamese aren't fighting for themselves. We're the ones doing the fighting. After I come back from Texas, that's going to change. There's no reason for us to lose another man over there. Vietnam is not worth another American life. It's not worth another American life," unquote. What did Bobby Kennedy say about Vietnam when he and John visited the country in 1951? John was a congressman. Both of them saw what was happening to the French. They were determined never to let that happen to the United States. When John got back, he tried to convince everyone who would listen and said, quote, "No amount of military assistance in Indochina can conquer an enemy that is everywhere and at the same time nowhere. And they have the sympathy and support of the people," unquote. What did LBJ do once Kennedy was dead? He issued National Security Action Memorandum 273, authorizing the start of the Vietnam War on November 26, 1963. Tell us about Edward Kennedy's speech at Robert's funeral. It can equally be applied to both Robert and John. Quote, "To be remembered simply as a good and decent man. Saw wrong and tried to right it. Saw suffering and tried to heal it. Saw war and tried to stop it. Some men see things as they are and say why. I dream things that never were and say, why not? Colonel Prudy was the Chief of Special Operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was sent to Antarctica to get him out of the way of the assassination. When he arrived at Christchurch, New Zealand, the newspaper there had a front-page story with Oswald's photograph and detailed information about him and the assassination. The interesting thing is, this was before Oswald had even been charged with the crime yet in Dallas. Obviously, the CIA put that story together and ran it had all been done weeks in advance. Thank you again for letting me be on your show. My book, The Murder Trial of JFK, is available on Amazon. Please purchase the red version and not the beige or the blue version of my book. Thank you very much.
Listen, what more can be said? And you know what's even more amazing about this is we've barely scratched the surface. There's still so much information left to be discovered. And that's why the onus is on you. There's no getting around it. Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com are the places you have to go. The Murder Trials of JFK is the title you have to pick up. And James O. Chipman is the author you have to thank for bringing this fantastic book to your table. So you know what you have to do. Head on over there and pick up your copies today. You surely will not be disappointed. James, once again, this has been an absolute honor. Thank you for being a guest with us today on People of Distinction.
Thank you as well. Really appreciate the opportunity I've had to be on your show.